I should have been asleep. It was almost midnight when I pulled into the driveway of my mother's old blue house, the one that still carried a faint scent of lavender and dust whenever the temperature dropped. After a double shift at the assisted living facility, my muscles buzzed with exhaustion, and all I wanted was darkness and quiet. Instead, I stepped out of my car and heard laughter drifting through the open front window. Not just any laughter, but a woman's bright, sugary giggle that did not belong in this house. My mother had been gone for over a year. My hand tightened around my keys as another sound followed a man's voice, deep, smug, familiar. Darren. For a moment I wished I had misheard, but then his shadow moved across the curtains, bold and careless like he owned the place. I pushed the door open and the smell of cheap perfume hit me so sharply it felt like walking into a wall. There he was standing in the middle of the living room as though it were some stage built for him alone. Darren in a leather jacket he could never afford, and a smile that said he had been waiting for an audience. Beside him, perched on the edge of my mother's sofa, was Amber. Her dress clung tight over her rounded stomach, and her hand drifted across it in a slow, indulgent circle as if she were presenting a prize. "Claire, look who finally decided to show up," Darren announced, lifting his arms with theatrical exaggeration. His eyes glittered with the shine of someone who had been drinking, but not enough to lose control. "From now on, this house will belong to my family. My child deserves the inheritance you stole." I stared at him stunned, though I should not have been. Darren had always believed the world owed him something, but this was a new height even for him. Amber tilted her head onto his shoulder, her lips curled into a smile that was both sweet and venomous. "Some people just are not meant to be heirs," she said. "Or mothers." The words landed like cold water poured down my spine. I took a step back, but Darren moved toward me, closing the distance. He lifted his hand and slammed it against the wooden shelf beside my face. The crack echoed through the house, and for a moment, all I heard was the ringing in my ears. He had not touched me, but the threat hung there heavy and deliberate. "Stop, Darren," I said, though my voice sounded thin. He grinned. "You are done, Claire. Completely done." Amber rose slowly, her hand still on her stomach. She held out a paper. "Pregnancy confirmation," she said, as though she were handing me a court summons. Darren reached into his jacket and tossed another document onto the coffee table. "A motion from the probate court." "They are opening the estate again," he said, triumph warm and sharp. "My kid has rights, more rights than you." That was not how probate worked, but Darren never cared about details, only about victory, real or imagined. I breathed in through my nose, fighting the tremble in my hands, and walked past them toward my mother's bedroom. The room was untouched, the quilt still folded, the drawer still slightly crooked, just as she left it. I knelt beside the dresser and opened the bottom drawer, sliding my hand along the back panel until my fingers brushed the thin line of the hidden compartment. Inside rested the envelope Lowell and I had prepared, a court-ordered request for a paternity test legally filed and approved. Darren liked to pretend he was winning, but he had no idea what the court expected from someone claiming future heirship. I stood slowly, envelope in hand. My reflection in the window showed a woman who looked both exhausted and strangely steady, the kind of steady that comes right before a storm breaks for the last time. I walked back into the hallway. Darren was bragging to Amber about how the judge would see right through me tomorrow. Amber giggled again, and the sound scraped against the walls like something sharp. Neither of them noticed me. They were too busy planning a victory that did not exist. I stepped closer and felt the cold night press against my back, while the envelope inside my purse seemed to warm like a living thing. The court order for the test had taken weeks, and every day of waiting felt like a rope tightening around my ribs. I thought of my mother's voice the night she whispered that I would need courage someday. I touched the sealed flap and breathed slowly. Tomorrow in front of Judge Meredith, Darren would perform and Amber would smile, but the truth inside that envelope would end everything. It would finally set everything right. My mother used to say that a house remembers the people who grow up inside it, and sometimes I think she meant it literally because every corner of this place carries the echo of the life we once had before everything fractured. Martha Whitford was a gentlewoman, the kind whose voice stayed soft even when she was angry and whose hands were always busy with something sewing, gardening, writing notes to her students. She taught second grade for almost 30 years, and children loved her because she made them feel seen in a way adults sometimes forget to do. When I was little, she kept a jar of honey sticks in her desk, and Darren used to sneak into her classroom to grab fistfuls of them. She never scolded him, just laughed and told him he would get a stomachache. He never did. Of course he would grin, sticky-mouthed, proud of himself for getting away with something again. That was Darren from the start, adored for being bold, forgiven for being reckless, praised for things I would have been punished for. I used to think that was normal, that brothers were supposed to be louder and angrier, and that girls were supposed to learn to breathe quietly so they did not provoke storms. The truth is more complicated. Darren was a child who learned early that he could bend the world by bending people. If he shoved another kid at school, the teacher would say, "Boys will be boys." If he broke something in the house, Mom would pay for it and tell him to be more careful. When he turned 15, he stopped pretending to try. He failed, classes skipped school, got suspended. By 17, he had dropped out entirely, insisting school was pointless and that he would make money his own way, even though he never actually worked a real job. I still remember the night he shoved me into the hallway wall because I had borrowed his charger without asking. The hit was not what hurt. It was the look on his face, the flash of satisfaction, the knowledge that he had found something he could control. Mom found me sitting on the floor afterward and wrapped her arms around me, telling me Darren was struggling and did not mean it. I nodded because I wanted to believe her, but the bruise that formed across my shoulder told the real story. I grew up learning to walk around his moods the way people learn to step around broken glass, careful, precise, quiet. By the time Darren turned 22, he had moved in with a group of guys who spent more time drinking than working. He floated between couches, always broke, always calling Mom for money, always promising to pay it back. He never did. I left for college, then returned home after 2 years when Mom started coughing at night and her weight began to drop in ways she tried to hide. The diagnosis came: fast lung cancer already spreading. I left my job and came home again because someone had to be there, and Darren was never the one who stayed. He visited twice, the first time hungover, the second time asking for money. Mom never said a bad word about him. She kept telling him she loved him, and he kept disappearing. During the final months, I slept on the couch outside her door so I could help her stand or get water or breathe through the pain when it seized her chest. Sometimes she would wake up crying, quietly, trying not to bother me. I always pretended not to hear until she whispered my name. Those months changed something inside me, not in a dramatic way, but in a slow settling of responsibility. The knowledge that I was the only person she could depend on. Darren did not come to the hospital until the day before she died, and even then, he stayed only long enough to tell her not to worry because everything would work out. He did not notice that she could barely whisper. After the funeral, the lawyer handed me the will, and even though I had known what it would say, it still felt like a weight in my hands. Mom had left the house to me along with her small savings account. Underlined in her handwriting was a note that said, "Claire, this is your home. Do not let anyone take it from you." She knew Darren would try. She knew the way he moved through life, grasping for things he had not earned. I sat on the porch that night reading the will while the maple tree rustled in the wind, and I felt grief twist with guilt because some part of me knew that Darren would see this as a betrayal. He always believed everything should belong to him simply because he was louder and angrier and more demanding. But Mom trusted me, not him, and that truth burned like a quiet star in my chest. In the months that followed, I tried to rebuild some kind of peace inside the house. I painted the kitchen, fixed the leaky bathroom sink, and planted herbs the way Mom used to. For a little while, life felt still. Then Darren returned. He did not knock, he never had. He burst through the front door, carrying the scent of beer and desperation, and told me the will was unfair. He said Mom loved him more than me and that she had only left the house to me because I had manipulated her in her final days. I told him that was not true. He lunged, then stopped himself, fists clenching. He looked like someone ready to fight, but not sure who the enemy was. I learned then that grief does not soften everyone. For some people, it sharpens the edges they already had. Darren's anger grew darker after that, fueled by debt, by addiction, by envy, by the belief that he had been robbed of something he never cared to protect while she was alive. And I learned in those months that the promise I had made to my mother would be tested in ways I could never have imagined. After the funeral, the house felt too quiet, almost hollow. as if every sound inside it belonged to someone who was no longer there. For weeks, I moved through it like a guest rather than a daughter, handling paperwork, watering Mom's plants, folding the last load of her laundry, even though I knew it would never be worn again. Grief has a strange way of making time stretch and collapse at the same moment. Some days I felt every minute like a weight, and others passed without me noticing at all. For nearly 4 months, Darren was nothing but a name on my caller ID, a name I often ignored. He sent a few short messages, each one a demand, not a question, telling me he needed money, or needed to stay at the house for a few nights, or needed access to Mom's account because it was only fair. I did not respond to most of them because I knew that giving him even a small opening would pull me back into the chaos I had only just escaped. I tried to believe he would drift away the way he always did, but Darren was not drifting this time. He was circling. When he finally returned, he did not knock. He arrived with the loud roar of an engine, one that did not match anything he should have been able to afford. I walked to the window and saw a dark sports coupe with tinted windows, the kind of car men buy when they want attention rather than transportation. Darren stepped out wearing a bomber jacket and sunglasses, though the sky was overcast. His smile was sharp, slick, rehearsed. Behind him, Amber climbed out of the passenger seat. She wore a bright red dress that did not match the cold wind and heels that clicked loudly on the walkway, like she wanted the entire neighborhood to hear her arrival. She surveyed the house with the possessive air of someone appraising property she had already claimed. When I opened the door, Darren pushed past me without waiting for an invitation. He walked through the living room, hands spread as if he were showing the place to a potential buyer. "Well, would you look at this?" he said, whistling softly, still standing. I ignored the comment and asked why he was here. He smiled the kind of smile he used when he was about to lie. "We thought we would stop by and talk grown-up things." "Right, Amber." She stepped forward, linking her arm through his with an intimacy so polished it felt performed. "We just want what is fair," she said. Her gaze swept over the photos on the wall, lingering on the one of Mom holding me as a toddler. She smirked slightly, then looked away. Darren got straight to it. "Half." He tapped the mantel with his knuckles. "The house, the savings, the land. Half is mine and half is yours. That is how family works." I reminded him Mom's will did not say that. He laughed as though I had told a joke. "Wills get challenged, Claire. You cannot hold on to something just because you were the only one around when she died." The words stung more than I expected. Mom's final months had been so painful and lonely, and I had carried all of it alone. To hear him weaponize that loneliness felt cruel in a way I had not been prepared for. I told him firmly that the house was not up for debate. Darren's smile vanished. His eyes hardened. "So that is how you want to do this." He stepped closer, and Amber watched with an expression that suggested she enjoyed the tension. Darren lowered his voice. "You think you can shut me out after everything I have done for this family?" I held my ground. "Darren, you did not do anything. You were never here. That broke something." His jaw twitched and his fists tightened, but he did not swing. Instead, he turned away, pacing like a caged animal. Amber sat on the sofa, crossing her legs slowly. She looked at me with detached amusement. "He is just stressed," she said. "This house could give us a fresh start. We could raise our family here." Family. The word hung in the air like smoke. I asked how long they had been together. Amber smiled. "Long enough." Her hand drifted to her still flat stomach as if foreshadowing what she would later claim. I realized then that Darren was not just back. He was planning something. And Amber was not a bystander. She was a participant, maybe even an instigator. After an hour of circling arguments, Darren finally stormed out muttering to himself. Amber followed, but paused at the door. "Claire," she said with a tilt of her head, "you can make this easy or you can make this hard. People like you always choose the hard way." She walked out without waiting for a reply. I shut the door and leaned against it, feeling a familiar old shakiness return. It had been months since Darren had been in this house, and yet within minutes he managed to fill it with the same old pressure, the same fear, the same uncertainty that had dictated so much of my childhood. That night, I checked the locks twice, then 3 times. I told myself I should not worry that he would leave again, but the truth is, I knew Darren. When he wanted something, he did not disappear. He dug in. Over the next weeks, the messages began. At first, they were vague requests for money or access to the house. Then they grew sharper. You owe me. Mom would want you to share. I need my part. Then the late-night calls followed, sometimes dozens in a row. Sometimes he said nothing, just breathed heavily and hung up. Other times he slurred insults, telling me I was selfish, unstable, ungrateful. I saved every voicemail, every text, every screenshot, not because I wanted to, but because some part of me sensed I would need proof one day. And then the threat shifted. Amber started messaging me too. Her words were sweeter, but sharper. You must feel lonely in that big house. Things will be easier for you once the estate is corrected. Estate is such a strong word for the life Mom left behind, but Amber used it with confidence. It was clear now. Darren was not drifting. He was hunting. And the house Mom trusted me to protect was exactly what he intended to take. Amber did not enter our lives like a storm. Storms at least announce themselves with wind and pressure and distant thunder. She slipped in quietly like a draft through a cracked window, a presence so subtle at first that you do not realize how cold the room has become until you start to shiver. The first time she came back to the house after Darren's resurfacing, she brought a box of pastries as if we were neighbors she was trying to charm rather than people whose lives she intended to rearrange. She stood in the doorway smiling sweetly, her voice light and friendly. "I thought we could start fresh," she said, holding out the box. "Darren hates it when family fights." Her tone was warm, but something underneath it felt off, like the smile of a woman who already knows she is holding cards you cannot see. I took the pastries out of politeness, but did not invite her inside. She did not seem bothered. She simply leaned forward slightly as though testing whether she could push herself across the threshold without permission. She tilted her head. "You know, Claire, I want this to be peaceful." My eyes drifted to her stomach, which was still flat. She noticed, and her hand floated casually toward it. "The baby has been a blessing," she said. "Darren tells me all the time how important it is to keep the family together now that the next generation is coming." The next generation. I could almost hear the echo of Darren's voice, the same entitlement, the same grasping tone he had used his whole life. I asked how far along she was. Her answer came without hesitation. 13 weeks. Later, I would remember that number clearly because 2 weeks after that, she told someone else she was 16 weeks. And then at her next checkup, she told the receptionist she was 11. The timelines changed and shifted like sand under water. Whenever I asked for clarification, Amber gave some gentle excuse, miscounting cycles, irregular periods, confusion about dates, all spoken with the confidence of someone who expected to be believed and resented being questioned. Over the next few weeks, Amber appeared more often than Darren, sometimes without him, sometimes waiting in her car while he circled the property checking what he could take. She always had something to say, something pleasant on the surface with a sharpness beneath it. "I brought over some prenatal vitamins your pharmacy forgot to give Darren last time," she said once, handing me a bag. "I guessed you wouldn't know much about these kinds of things." The implication hung between us. She repeated those kinds of comments often enough that it became clear they were not accidents. The jabs were delicate, strategically placed, designed to make me feel inadequate or inferior. She made a point of talking to neighbors, too. I overheard her tell Mrs. Givens next door that she and Darren were planning to fix up the old house once everything was sorted legally. She stressed the word legally with a tone that said she already considered the outcome decided. One Saturday morning, she waved at me from the sidewalk while Darren prowled near the garage, examining tools that had been our father's. She walked up to me, brushing her hair behind her shoulder. "You know, Claire," she said, "we do not have to be enemies. When this baby comes, things will change. Families grow." I stayed silent, but she continued anyway. "Sometimes people get so attached to material things that they forget what family means." Her smile hardened at the edges. "You do not want to be the reason Darren's child grows up without stability, do you?" There it was. The first clear threat hidden inside sugary phrasing. Something in my chest tightened because I knew this was not random. Amber had chosen her position carefully. She wanted to be seen as the reasonable one, the calm one, the soft-spoken woman trying to mediate. Darren had always relied on anger to get what he wanted, but Amber used something more subtle: manipulation dressed as kindness. It did not take long for me to understand Amber was not a victim of Darren's chaos. She was a partner in it, maybe even the architect. One day, I saw her at the community clinic where my mother used to volunteer. She was checking in at the front desk for a prenatal appointment. She smiled at the nurse and said loudly, "My boyfriend wants to make sure the baby is healthy since it is his first." The nurse congratulated her and asked for the father's information. Amber gave Darren's full name clearly and confidently. That moment was the turning point. If a pregnant woman formally identifies a man as the father in a medical setting and then claims that child has inheritance rights, the court has grounds to require a legal paternity test. I felt something shift inside me, not triumph, but clarity. I left the clinic that afternoon and drove straight to Lowell's office. When I explained the situation, he leaned back, tapping his pen against a folder. If she is claiming heirship through the unborn child, the judge can absolutely order a paternity test, he said. And if Darren is attaching the claim to probate, he has to cooperate. This is not about the pregnancy, Claire. This is about leverage. Until that moment, I had been reacting, trying to defend myself from whatever Darren or Amber threw my way. But hearing Lowell speak so plainly made something click. They were not just harassing me. They were building a strategy. If the baby was Darren's, they could reopen probate. If probate reopened, they could challenge the will. If they challenged the will, they could force a settlement. It was a ladder built out of lies and pressure and intimidation, but a ladder they fully intended to climb. Lowell filed the request with the court the next morning. Over the following days, Amber's attitude shifted noticeably. She smiled too much, asked too many questions, danced around topics with an eagerness that felt forced. Once she stood in my doorway and said, "If you ever want to talk from one woman to another, I am here." I wanted to ask her why her story kept changing, and why her confidence felt like the kind of confidence people have only when they believe they will never be caught. But I stayed quiet, remembering Lowell's calm voice, reminding me that silence was sometimes the strongest strategy. I watched her walk away, hand on her stomach posture, perfect as though she were already posing for a future she believed belonged to her. But I had the envelope now, and Amber had no idea that the truth she had tried to weaponize was the same truth that would undo everything she and Darren had built out of manipulation and lies. The letter from the probate court arrived on a Thursday morning, folded neatly inside a white envelope with the county seal stamped in blue ink. I found it on the porch next to a package of gardening gloves I had ordered earlier that week. At first, I thought it was another form about the estate wrapping up, but when I opened it, my stomach dropped. The court had agreed to review the motion Darren filed to reopen the probate case. It did not overturn the will, and it did not change ownership, but it did mean I would be forced back into a legal battle I thought had ended with my mother's burial. I sat at the kitchen table reading the document twice, my hands trembling not from fear exactly, but from the heavy realization that Darren had managed to push this fight into a system that required time, energy, and strength. Strength I was not sure I had. According to the letter, Darren had claimed that I manipulated Mom during her final months, that I coerced her into signing documents, that I influenced her wishes by isolating her. He wrote that I was emotionally unstable and unfit to manage property. Reading those words felt like swallowing something sharp. The idea that Darren could twist the final months of Mom's life into a story where he was a victim was more painful than his insults ever had been. I called Lowell immediately, and he answered on the second ring, his calm, steady voice grounding me. "Bring everything," he said. "The will, every medical record, every voicemail, every message from Darren." When I walked into his office later that afternoon, his desk was already covered in files. He had pulled my mother's medical charts, her hospice paperwork, her power of attorney documents. He glanced at the motion, then set it down with a tired sigh. "These accusations are common," he said. "People lash out when they feel entitled to something they never earned." He looked at me over his glasses. "Claire, they have not reopened the estate. They have only agreed to hear the claim. That is different," but the weight in my chest did not lift. He must have sensed it. Darren does not understand how the law works. He thinks yelling and filing motions will intimidate you or push you into settling, but the will is clear, completely clear. You were the caregiver. You were present. Your mother made a decision based on trust and love, not manipulation, and Darren's absence works against him, not you. Lowell spoke with the steady certainty of a man who had handled hundreds of broken families and the legal battles that followed. Still, I asked the question pressing against my ribs. Can Darren actually take anything? Lowell shook his head. Not unless he proves coercion, and there is no evidence of that, but he is trying to create noise to pressure you. This is a tactic, not a victory. His reassurance steadied me, though the knot inside me did not fully loosen. Over the next week, the paperwork multiplied. Darren's lawyer filed an affidavit painting him as the devoted son who had been pushed out of the home. He claimed Darren was ready to step up as a father and needed the house for his new family. He wrote that I had refused to support them and that I had developed unpredictable emotional tendencies since Mom's death. Reading it made me feel physically sick. Darren had always lied, but seeing the lies written down in formal legal language gave them a new weight. It reminded me how far he would go when he felt cornered. Meanwhile, Amber's story continued to expand. She told neighbors I had threatened her. She told a woman from Mom's old church group that I had tried to shove her during one of their visits. She said she was afraid to come near me and that the stress was affecting the baby. I kept track of every rumor, every twisted version of events. They were building a narrative designed to make me appear dangerous and Darren appear protective. It was not enough to win in court. They wanted to win in public, too. The pressure grew sharper when I received another notice from the court. Darren was demanding the right to access the house for appraisal, claiming he needed to evaluate potential value for his share. Lowell filed an objection immediately, but the thought of Darren legally stepping inside Mom's home filled me with dread. The house was the last place where her voice echoed each memory stored like a fragile shell. The idea of Darren tearing through her belongings, searching for anything he could claim as his, sent a cold pulse through my chest. That night, I found myself sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by Mom's things. Her old writing desk, her favorite mug, the faded quilt she used on cold evenings. I felt so small sitting there, so overwhelmed by the idea that her memory had become a battlefield. I remembered her hand holding mine the day she showed me the will, her voice thin but sure. "This is your home, Claire. Promise me you will stand up for it." I whispered out loud as though she could still hear me. I do not know if I am strong enough. The room felt quiet in the way hospitals feel quiet, the kind of quiet that holds sorrow rather than peace. Then my phone buzzed, a voicemail from Darren slurred with the sound of a bar in the background. "Claire, you think you won. You stole everything, but that house is mine and the court will see it, even if I have to drag you there myself." His laugh was low, mean, and humorless. I saved the message as evidence, but the truth was, it shook me. It reminded me that Darren was not finished, not even close. The second wake-up call came when Amber left a neatly folded note on my porch the next morning. It said simply, "We will get what is ours." I took the note to Lowell and he frowned reading it twice. "They are escalating, but they are also careless. Every message, every rumor, every threat strengthens our case." He placed a hand on the file containing the court-approved paternity test order. "This is the piece they are not prepared for, the piece they cannot twist. Darren thinks he can use the unborn child as a weapon, but once this test comes back, the entire foundation of their claim collapses." As I left his office, I felt something shift, not a surge of confidence, but a quiet tightening of resolve. Darren and Amber believed they were winning. They believed they were circling me, trapping me, wearing down my strength until I surrendered. But they did not know about the envelope. They did not know that every step they took forward was leading them closer to the truth they had not prepared for, a truth that would break everything they thought they controlled. The escalation did not happen all at once. It came in slow, hard steps, like someone tightening a rope little by little until you can no longer pretend you are breathing normally. The first sign was the late-night banging. It was just after 11 on a Thursday when the pounding started at the front door, sharp, irregular thuds that rattled the frame. At first, I froze, thinking it might be a stranger. Then I heard the voice behind the hits and my stomach clenched. Claire opened the door. Darren's voice was thick and slurred, but still loud enough to echo through the hallway. I crept toward the peephole, expecting to see him alone. Instead, Amber stood behind him in the driveway, leaning against their dented sedan, her arms folded tight against the cold. Her expression was not concerned or frightened. She looked almost bored. Darren slammed the door again. "I know you are in there. Open the door before I break it down." I knew calling the police immediately would only fuel his rage, so I opened the deadbolt, keeping the chain in place. "What do you want, Darren?" He shoved the door so hard the chain strained. "Let me in. We need to talk." I could smell the alcohol through the gap in the doorway, the sharp, bitter smell that always meant trouble. "You are drunk. Come back tomorrow," he snarled. "You do not get to tell me when I can come into my house." "It is not your house," I said, but the shake in my voice betrayed me. Darren grinned like he had been waiting for that crack. He shoved again and the chain snapped off the frame. He stumbled inside, not quite falling, but close. Instinctively, I stepped back, putting space between us, but he closed it quickly, moving with the unpredictable lunge of someone whose anger held him upright more than his balance. "Look at you acting like a victim," he said. "You think you are better because Mom handed everything to you. That is not what happened, Darren." He moved closer and slammed his hand against the hallway wall, inches from my face. The sound shot through my chest. "Mom is dead because of you," he said, voice breaking on the last word. "You drained her. You made her sign things she did not understand. All lies. All things he needed to believe to justify his own absence." I tried to keep my breathing steady. "Please leave." Darren leaned in so close I could feel the heat of his breath. "Tomorrow the judge will take everything from you. Then we will see who walks out of that courtroom owning this house." He pushed off the wall and staggered back a few steps, rubbing his face as though he were trying to decide his next move. I held my ground, though my heart hammered inside my chest. Outside, Amber laughed a short, cold laugh. "We should go, Darren." She sounded amused, not alarmed. Darren shot her a glare, but she turned toward the car. He muttered something under his breath, then stormed out, brushing against me hard enough to make me stumble. In their headlights, I saw the two of them arguing. Amber gesturing toward me, Darren throwing his hands wildly. Finally, they drove off, leaving a spray of gravel across the yard. My hands shook as I closed and locked the door. I pressed my forehead against it, breathing slowly until the shaking dulled. When I called the police, the dispatcher's voice was calm, almost weary, as if she had handled 1,000 calls, just like mine. Officers arrived 10 minutes later, taking notes as I replayed what happened. "Did he touch you?" one of them asked. "No." "Did he force entry?" The chain snapped. He pushed the door, but I opened it first. The officers exchanged a glance. Without physical assault or property damage beyond the chain, there was nothing they could arrest him for. They filed an incident report and told me to document every interaction. "If he comes back tonight, call again," one officer said. "And tomorrow morning go to the courthouse to request a restraining order." His tone was firm, but sympathetic. "People like your brother, they get worse before they get better," he added softly. After they left the house, felt unnervingly quiet. I checked every lock twice, then sat at the kitchen table staring at the grain of the wood until it blurred. I kept replaying Darren's words. "Tomorrow the judge will take everything from you." They felt less like a prediction and more like a threat. I slept in fragmented pieces that night, waking at every sound outside. At sunrise, I found fresh boot prints in the frost near the garden old leather tread with a faint circular crack on one heel. Darren's boots. He had come back sometime after the police left, watching. The next morning, I was still shaken, but Lowell insisted we stick to the plan. "Bring the incident report," he said. "It shows pattern." I nodded, though my hands would not stop trembling. "It will be fine," he added more gently. "Darren is spiraling. People who spiral make mistakes, and courts notice those mistakes." On my lunch break at work, my phone buzzed with a message from a neighbor. Amber was outside my house again, leaning against the fence, smiling at people walking by. When I returned home, she was gone, but a small envelope lay on the porch. Inside was a printed photo of a nursery layout clipped from a catalog. On the back, she had written in neat cursive, "A home should be ready for a baby, not wasted on someone alone." I took the photo to Lowell and placed it on his desk. He frowned, tapping the corner with his pen. "They are trying to intimidate you psychologically," he said. "It is not enough to make a legal impact, but it is useful. It demonstrates coercive behavior." The phrase stuck with me. Coercive behavior, a term used in domestic violence cases. I had always thought of abuse as something that left marks on the skin, but the steady grind of fear and pressure could carve something just as deep. That night, the house creaked with the familiar sounds of settling wood, yet each one startled me. I kept checking the window, Darren's face in my mind appearing in the glass. When I finally slept, my dreams were filled with doors breaking open, shadows moving down the hallway, the echo of Darren's voice accusing me of crimes I never committed. I woke with a start at 3 in the morning. The yard was still. The house was still. My breathing slowed, but the fear stayed. I realized then that Darren was no longer just a danger to the inheritance. He was a danger to me, and tomorrow in court, he would be given the stage he always craved a room full of people to perform for. But I would not enter that room empty-handed. The envelope sat ready in my purse, a quiet truth waiting to shatter everything Darren believed he could control. The courthouse sat at the edge of town, a square brick building with tall windows that always reminded me of a school my mother once taught in. People entered it with the same posture children carried on test days, shoulders tense, breath shallow, pretending they were ready. I arrived early because Lowell insisted we needed time to settle ourselves before Darren made his grand entrance. Even so, I felt my nerves buzzing as I stepped into the long hallway lined with wooden benches. The familiar courthouse scent, a mix of old varnish floor cleaner and something paper dry, wrapped around me like an unwelcome cloak. A few people waited for unrelated hearings, talking quietly or scrolling their phones. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe, thinking maybe this would be just another routine, hearing an argument, a review of documents, nothing more. Then I heard the laughter. Loud, animated, theatrical. Darren's laugh. It carried down the hallway long before he came into view. He turned the corner like a man entering a stage, his back, straight shoulders squared, his expression polished into something meant to impress. He wore a navy suit that did not fit quite right, shoulders too wide for his frame, as if he had borrowed someone else's life for the day. His hair was slicked back with more gel than necessary, shining under the fluorescent lights, and beside him, walking with deliberate poise, was Amber. She clutched his arm lightly, her hand resting near her abdomen so everyone could see the gesture. She wore a soft beige dress that flattered the curve of her stomach makeup, carefully done so her cheeks glowed as if touched by maternal innocence. Anyone who did not know her might have believed she was a woman, excited to build a family, not one who had threatened me with handwritten notes. They walked slowly, giving people ample time to notice them. Darren spoke loudly enough for those sitting on the benches to hear every word. "I just hope the judge sees the truth today. Family deserves fairness." Amber nodded solemnly, eyes cast down just enough to appear fragile. I stayed seated on a bench at the far side of the hallway, watching them move as a pair. Darren's gaze swept the hallway before landing on me. His smile widened. "Claire," he said in a tone dripping with false warmth. "Good to see you. You are earlier than I expected." Amber squeezed his arm. "Poor thing," she said softly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She must be under so much stress." My stomach tightened, but I kept my face still. I knew this was part of their strategy, the carefully crafted performance meant to influence anyone who might later be called as a witness. The hallway grew quieter as more people realized a family drama was unfolding in real time. Darren lived for this kind of attention. He turned slightly to speak to an older couple on a bench. "This whole situation is just heartbreaking," he said, lowering his voice in an imitation of sincerity. "My sister has been unstable since our mother passed. We are trying our best to help her through it." The couple nodded sympathetically, unaware that Darren's version of help usually came in the form of rage and threats. Before I could react, Lowell appeared beside me, walking with his steady, deliberate stride. He carried a binder under one arm and gave me a small nod. "You are doing fine," he whispered. "Do not respond to anything he says out here. He wants you rattled before we walk in." Darren noticed Lowell and his expression changed from condescension to irritation. "Lowell," he called out as if greeting an old friend he secretly despised. "Ready to twist some truth today." Lowell smiled politely. "The truth does not need twisting, Darren. It tends to hold its shape better than lies." A ripple of quiet amusement passed among a few people nearby. Darren's jaw tightened. Amber leaned closer, whispering something into his ear while glaring at Lowell. The courtroom doors opened briefly as a bailiff stepped out calling for another case. Darren straightened instantly, adjusting his tie, running his hand down his jacket. He was preparing himself the way actors prepare for a scene. I wondered how many times he had rehearsed his story, how many versions he had told himself until he believed them. As the minutes passed, more people gathered. Some were here for unrelated cases, but none could resist watching the tension building in the hallway. Darren thrived in their attention. At one point, he placed a hand on Amber's stomach and spoke just loudly enough for the crowd. "This little one deserves a fair chance at a future. No child should be denied their birthright." Amber nodded tearfully, though no actual tears fell. I felt heat rise in my face, but Lowell touched my arm lightly. "He knows the paternity test results," he whispered. "This bravado is fear, nothing more." That steadied me, though. The knot in my stomach stayed tight. When the bailiff finally stepped back into the hallway and announced our case, both Darren and Amber snapped to attention. Darren squeezed Amber's hand dramatically and whispered, "Let us finish this." As we lined up to enter the courtroom, Darren positioned himself in front, forcing others to step aside. He pulled the door open with a flourish, guiding Amber through as though they were guests of honor. But when I stepped into the room, the familiar solemnity wrapped around me like a protective shield. The rows of wooden pews the judge's bench raised slightly above the floor, the seal of the state hanging behind it. These symbols did not belong to Darren's world of chaos. They belonged to order, to truth, to evidence, to consequences. Darren paused near the front table, glancing at the spectators filling the benches. He was soaking in their attention, their curiosity, their silent anticipation. This was not a hearing to him. This was a performance. Amber settled beside him, placing her hands over her stomach again, her expression a perfect mask of vulnerability. Darren looked at me, then the judge's empty chair, then the folder Lowell carried. His confidence flickered for a moment. A brief flash of panic crossed his eyes before he smoothed it away. It was then I realized the performance was not for the judge or the room. It was for himself. He needed to believe this version of events. He needed the story he created to be real, because if it was not, then everything he had done since Mom died would collapse into a truth he could not bear to face. The bailiff called for silence. Darren inhaled deeply, lifting his chin. "Showtime," he whispered to Amber. And as the judge entered the room, I felt the envelope in Lowell's binder like a pulse waiting to detonate. Tomorrow had arrived, and Darren had no idea that the script he prepared would not survive the truth waiting inside that envelope. When Judge Meredith entered the courtroom, the air shifted into something heavier, more disciplined, the way a storm quiets the world before it breaks. She was a woman in her early 60s with sharp gray hair cut close to her jaw and eyes that missed nothing. People in town often said she could read guilt the way other people read weather, and standing in that room, I believed it. Everyone rose as she took her seat, then the bailiff called the room to order. Darren straightened his suit jacket one last time, and Amber adjusted the hem of her beige dress, making sure her hands were placed just so over her stomach. Their choreography was practiced and intentional. I felt Lowell place a calm, steadying hand on my arm before we sat. Judge Meredith glanced down at the file in front of her, flipping through the pages with efficient motions. When she finally looked up, her gaze was level and unamused. "We are here to address the petition submitted by Mr. Darren Whitford to reopen the probate of the estate of the late Martha Whitford," she said. The tone of her voice made it very clear this was not a show, and she would not tolerate anyone who tried to make it one. Darren stood so smoothly, it was clear he had rehearsed it. "Thank you, Your Honor. My sister and I have gone through a lot since our mother passed, and I am here simply to make sure the truth is acknowledged." Judge Meredith held up a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Whitford. You will speak when spoken to." Darren's mouth opened slightly, then closed. A faint flush crept up his neck. Lowell leaned toward me, whispering, She already knows what type he is. Darren sank back into his chair, but his jaw shifted restlessly. The judge turned to Lowell. Counselors, I have reviewed the filings, but I want both sides to present their positions concisely. Mr. Whitford's attorney may begin. Darren's lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, rose, holding a stack of notes, though he barely glanced at them. Your Honor, my client has reason to believe that the decedent was not in a sound emotional state during the last weeks before signing the will. Evidence suggests that Ms. Claire Whitford may have exerted undue influence, resulting in a decision that does not accurately reflect Mrs. Whitford's intentions regarding her son and future grandchild. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. The unborn child deserves consideration in this estate. It is both ethical and necessary. Judge Meredith's eyes narrowed. Ethical and necessary, she repeated. Counselor, we will stick to legal standards, not emotional rhetoric. Please continue. The lawyer cleared his throat. We intend to demonstrate that Ms. Whitford acted with controlling behavior, isolating her mother and manipulating estate decisions while my client was prevented from participating as a son. He sat. Judge Meredith nodded once, then turned her attention to Lowell. Your response. Lowell rose, calmly smoothing the front of his jacket with a deliberate gesture. Your Honor, the claims made by the petitioner are not supported by evidence. The medical records demonstrate that Mrs. Whitford retained full mental capacity throughout the period in question. The will was signed in the presence of legal witnesses who verified her clarity and intent. Additionally, we will be providing documented evidence contradicting Mr. Whitford's motives and credibility, including incident reports, threatening messages, and financial inconsistencies. A quiet stir moved through the gallery at the word threatening. Darren stiffened. Lowell continued in the same even tone. As for the unborn child, the court has already issued a paternity inquiry, and we have complied. Judge Meredith nodded. That matter will be addressed when presented. Continue. Lowell sat. The judge turned first to Darren, then to me. Before testimony begins, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. I do not tolerate outbursts, manipulation, or theatrics. If anyone raises their voice, they will be removed. Darren forced a confident smile, but the muscles around his mouth twitched. Very well, the judge said. Mr. Whitford, please approach the stand. And just like that, Darren's performance began. He walked to the witness stand with practiced humility, as though each step was drenched in sorrow. After he was sworn in, he folded his hands and projected his voice across the courtroom with just enough tremble to sound wounded. My sister has always struggled emotionally, he began. When Mom got sick, Claire took over everything. She would not let me see Mom when she was weak. She made decisions without including me. I tried to help, but Claire pushed me out. He paused dramatically, glancing toward the spectators. When Mom signed the will, she was heavily medicated. I do not think she fully understood what she was signing. Lowell did not react, but I felt heat rising in my chest. Darren continued painting himself as the dutiful son shunned by a controlling sister. He described me as hostile, paranoid, unstable. The lies slid from his mouth with practiced ease. Then Amber joined him on the stand. She spoke softly, her voice trembling as if she were barely holding herself together. Claire threatened me once, she whispered. She told me I was trying to take her place in the family. I was scared to come near the house. Darren squeezed her hand as she pretended to wipe away a tear that did not exist. She launched into a long, embellished story of how I had supposedly yelled at her in Mom's house, accusing her of disrespecting the space and trying to steal what did not belong to her. Her voice quivered in all the right places. The gallery watched with rapt attention. When Lowell finally rose for cross-examination, he approached, slowly opening his binder as if unbothered by the theatrics. Ms. Cooper, he said, addressing Amber with her last name. You stated earlier that you were afraid to approach Ms. Whitford. Yes, she whispered. Lowell nodded and pulled out a printed record. Then, could you explain why you visited her home 14 times in the last month? He held up a copy of security camera timestamps. The courtroom murmured. Amber's mouth opened, then closed. Darren shot her a furious look. Lowell did not stop. And on 6 of those visits were you not the one who initiated conversation? She swallowed. I just wanted to keep the peace. Lowell's voice sharpened. Did you ever tell neighbors that Ms. Whitford was jealous because she could not have children? Amber froze. Darren leaned forward a little too quickly. She never said that. Lowell lifted another document. 3 written witness statements say otherwise. The gallery murmured again. Amber shrank slightly in her seat for the first time, losing the confidence she had flaunted all morning. Lowell let the silence hang before returning to our table. Judge Meredith observed everything with a steady, unreadable gaze. Then she turned to Darren's lawyer. Call your next witness. But none of Darren's remaining witnesses, the neighbors he had manipulated, or the motel friend he dragged into this mess, could provide solid proof. They gave vague statements based on Darren's exaggerated stories, nothing legally substantial. By the time Judge Meredith signaled for a break, Darren's confidence had dimmed, though he tried to mask it with forced smiles. Amber stared at the floor, twisting a tissue between her fingers. I felt Lowell lean close. We are moving into evidence after recess, he whispered. That is when everything starts to crumble. Across the aisle, Darren looked at me with a sneer meant to intimidate, but behind it something else flickered. Fear. Real fear. Because the courtroom was no longer his stage. It was becoming something he could not control. And the truth waiting in Lowell's binder was about to reshape the narrative Darren had rehearsed so long he thought it was reality. When the judge returned after recess, the atmosphere inside the courtroom felt different, heavier, tighter, as though everyone sensed the shift that was about to happen. Darren and Amber walked back to their seats, looking less coordinated than before. Their earlier confidence now stretched thin. Darren bounced his knee under the table the way he always did when cornered. Amber kept smoothing her dress over her lap, avoiding eye contact with the gallery. Judge Meredith settled into her seat, tapped her pen once against the bench, and said, Counsel for the respondent, you may proceed with your evidentiary presentation. Lowell rose calmly with the binder he had prepared long before today. His composure alone seemed to shrink the room around Darren. Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, we would like to present several exhibits demonstrating a clear pattern of harassment, psychological intimidation, and coercive behavior by Mr. Darren Whitford toward my client, Ms. Claire Whitford. The word harassment rippled softly through the spectators. Darren sat up straighter, like he had been stung. Your Honor, he began, but the judge raised a hand without even looking at him. You will remain silent until addressed. Darren's mouth snapped shut. Lowell walked toward the center of the courtroom and placed a small speaker on the evidence table. First exhibit audio documentation dated 2 months after the decedent's death. He pressed play. The recording began with the loud thud of a fist hitting wood, then Darren's voice slurred thick with anger. Claire, you think you can keep that house to yourself? You stole everything from me. Open the door or I swear to God I will make you regret this. The room froze. Every person in the gallery looked at Darren simultaneously. His face went pale. That is taken out of context, he muttered, but again the judge silenced him with a single sharp glance. Lowell continued unfazed. Exhibit 2 voicemail message left on the respondent's phone 1 week later. Another recording played Darren's voice again, this time more controlled, but dripping with menace. You cannot hide behind Mom's will forever. The court will see through you. And when they do, you are going to lose everything. Lowell clicked off the recording. The judge's expression did not move, but something in her eyes sharpened. Darren shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar, as though it had suddenly become too tight. Lowell opened the binder again. We also have Exhibit 3 security footage from the night of November 14th, when Mr. Whitford appeared at Ms. Whitford's home, uninvited for the 3rd time that week. The bailiff wheeled a small screen forward and played the footage. The grainy video showed Darren staggering toward the porch, pounding on the door, then leaning so close to the camera that his distorted, drunken face filled the screen. Claire opened the door. Stop pretending you are better than me. The gallery watched in stunned silence. A woman in the back row covered her mouth. Another shook her head slowly, as if seeing something she recognized all too well. Darren looked around wildly. I was checking on her, he insisted. She was unstable. Lowell did not acknowledge him. Instead, he pulled out the next stack of papers. Exhibit 4 text messages sent from Mr. Whitford over the course of 3 months. He read them aloud. You cannot keep me out forever. You owe me. You will regret this fight. You are not safe in that house alone. With each message, the atmosphere tightened another notch until even Amber looked unsettled, her eyes darting sideways at Darren as if she too had never seen the full collection laid out together. Lowell approached the bench and handed the printed texts to the judge, who read them slowly, her jaw tightening. "Mr. Whitford," she said finally, "do you dispute sending these messages?" Darren swallowed. "I was frustrated. Your Honor, my sister was not cooperating." "Frustration is not a legal justification for threats," the judge said. Her voice remained level, but her tone cut like cold steel. Darren opened his mouth, then shut it again. Lowell returned to the evidence table. "In addition, Your Honor, we have 3 witness statements from neighbors who observed erratic or aggressive behavior by Mr. Whitford during this period, including one instance in which he shouted at Ms. Whitford across the street, accusing her of poisoning their mother's mind." The judge flipped through the statements and exhaled slowly, the first visible sign of her own reaction. "Mr. Whitford, these accounts paint a troubling picture." Darren's lawyer rose, attempting damage control. "Your Honor, my client was experiencing emotional distress and did not intend harm. He was grieving. Grief does not excuse intimidation," the judge said without looking at him. "Proceed, Mr. Lowell." Lowell nodded. "Finally, Your Honor, we intend to demonstrate that Mr. Whitford's pattern of harassment was not isolated but part of a larger attempt to destabilize and pressure Ms. Whitford during the probate process." He opened the binder to the last section. "And that brings us to Exhibit 8, the handwritten note left by Ms. Amber Cooper on the respondent's porch." Amber jerked as though struck. "I never threatened her." Lowell held up the note. On the front, a picture of a nursery clipped from a catalog. On the back, the words, "We will get what is ours." The judge stared at the note, then at Amber. "Ms. Cooper, do you deny writing this?" Amber stammered. "I was misunderstood. I did not mean it like that. It was a message of reconciliation." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Reconciliation? That is your interpretation of this message." Amber nodded too quickly. "Yes." The judge exhaled through her nose, a gesture of skepticism unmistakable to everyone watching. The gallery buzzed softly. People shifted, leaning toward each other, whispering. Someone near the aisle shook her head, muttering, "That girl is lying." Darren's shoulders tensed as Lowell concluded. "Your Honor, these exhibits demonstrate a clear, sustained pattern of threatening conduct toward my client. Behavior that not only undermines the credibility of Mr. Whitford's claims, but suggests a strong motive to manipulate the outcome of the estate proceedings." The judge folded her hands and stared at Darren for a long, unbroken moment. "Mr. Whitford, the evidence presented raises serious concerns regarding your intentions, your truthfulness, and your behavior during the estate process. Do you have anything to say before we proceed?" Darren leaned forward, gripping the table. "She provoked me," he said, his voice cracking. "Claire has always pushed me. She makes herself look innocent, but she deserved it." Those 3 words hung in the air like a dropped weapon. She deserved it. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Lowell slowly turned his head toward me and whispered softly, "He just exposed himself." Judge Meredith's expression hardened. "Mr. Whitford, approach the bench now." Darren froze, but the bailiff gestured firmly. He stood and walked toward the judge, his hands shaking slightly. The judge lowered her voice, but the room was quiet enough that every syllable carried. "What you just said does not excuse your behavior. It condemns it." She leaned back. "Return to your seat." Darren did so reluctantly, looking shaken for the first time all day. And in that moment, I realized something. His performance was over. The mask had cracked, and from here on the truth would only get louder. The courtroom had already begun tilting against Darren, but when Judge Meredith announced that we would proceed to matters concerning the unborn child, the air shifted again the way it does right before lightning strikes. Every person in the gallery seemed to lean forward at once. Amber straightened in her seat, smoothing her dress as though preparing for admiration, not scrutiny. Darren lifted his chin, confidence creeping back into his posture. This was the card he believed would save him the peace he had built his entire case around. "Your Honor," Darren's lawyer said as he rose, "we respectfully request that the court recognize the interests of the unborn child. The estate should not be settled without acknowledging the rights of Mr. Whitford's future heir." Judge Meredith raised a hand. "We will address that. Please be seated." The lawyer sat lips pressed thin. Lowell stood with the same deliberate calm he had displayed all morning. "Your Honor, as the court ordered, my client has fully complied with the request for a paternity determination. The results have been returned and are ready for submission." Darren straightened so quickly his chair scraped the floor. "Good," he muttered loud enough for several people to hear. "Let us prove she is lying." Amber placed a trembling hand over her stomach. It would have looked tender if I had not known her well enough to see the calculation behind her eyes. Lowell approached the bench with a sealed envelope, the one he had guarded like a live wire for weeks. He handed it to the clerk, who walked it to the judge. The room went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that carries weight, expectation, dread. Judge Meredith broke the seal, unfolded the papers, and read them with a slow, controlled expression. Her eyes moved from left to right, line by line. Then she paused. The entire room waited. The judge lifted her gaze. Her expression had changed in a way that even she could not disguise. Surprise sharpened into clarity, clarity hardened into judicial certainty. Based on the court-ordered DNA analysis, she said, her voice ringing through the room, the probability of paternity is 0%. The words did not explode. They detonated. A sound erupted from Darren, half gasp, half shout, the noise of someone watching the only rope holding him up suddenly snap. "What the hell are you talking about?" he blurted. "That is impossible." Amber's mouth fell open, then closed, then opened again. She blinked rapidly, her face paling beneath the foundation she had so carefully applied. Darren stood abruptly, knocking his chair over. "I am the father," he shouted. "I am the father." The judge slammed her gavel once. "Sit down." Darren ignored her, rounding on Amber. "Tell her. Tell them all." Amber clutched her stomach as though she could shield herself from the truth. Darren's voice cracked as it climbed into panic. "Tell them I am the father." Amber's lower lip trembled. Her eyes glossed with tears. Real ones this time, not theatrical. She whispered, then swallowed hard. Darren leaned toward her aggressively. "Tell them." Amber shook her head. "I cannot." The word landed like a slap. Darren staggered back as though physically struck. His face twisted. "Who is the father?" he roared, voice echoing off the paneled walls. "Who is it, Amber, who did this? Who did you let touch you?" The judge raised her gavel again. "Mr. Whitford, if you do not control yourself, you will be removed from this courtroom." But Darren did not hear her. He was spiraling too fast, collapsing inward like a star, dying in real time. He looked around wildly, as though searching for someone to blame, anyone but himself. "Tell me," he shouted again. "Tell me." Amber covered her face with her hands and sobbed into them. Not delicate sobs. Gut-wrenching ones that told the truth she had been running from finally caught her. "I do not know," she choked out. "I do not know." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even Lowell's brows lifted for a fraction of a second. Darren's voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. "You cheated on me." "With who?" Amber cried harder. "I do not know, Darren. I do not know." Darren grabbed the back of his chair to steady himself. His face had gone the color of ash. The judge spoke with firm authority, cutting through the chaos. "Order. Now." Silence finally pulled the room taut again, though Darren's chest heaved with the force of his anger. Judge Meredith turned her attention to the record before her. Based on these results, and until proven otherwise, the unborn child has no legal standing in this estate. These findings render the petitioner's claim irrelevant in relation to inheritance. Darren's lawyer sank slowly into his chair. Amber's shoulders collapsed inward. Darren swayed as though the floor itself had shifted under him. He tried to speak, but no sound came. The judge continued. Furthermore, the court recognizes that Mr. Whitford was aware of this ongoing paternity inquiry. His insistence on using the pregnancy to reopen this estate raises questions about his intent and credibility. The gallery murmured loudly. A few people shook their heads. Some whispered things like unbelievable or that poor girl or he did this to himself. Amber tried to collect herself, but she looked hollowed out, undone. Darren bent down, picked up his fallen chair with shaking hands, and sat slowly as though each motion hurt. His glare shifted from Amber to me, burning with something between betrayal and hatred. "This is your doing," he hissed under his breath. "I know it is." Lowell leaned in slightly. "You did this to yourself," he murmured. Darren slammed his fist onto the table, making Amber jump. The bailiff moved forward, but the judge waved him back. The outburst only worsened Darren's image. When the judge spoke again, her tone was final. "The claim of expected inheritance through the unborn child is now dismissed. We will proceed to final arguments concerning the petitioner's remaining allegations." Darren sagged back into his chair, staring ahead with empty eyes. The revelation had not just broken his case. It had shattered the story he had convinced himself was true. I could almost see the moment when denial gave way to truth, when his last hope evaporated. Amber whispered something to him, but he jerked away from her like her presence physically repulsed him now. Lowell tapped the envelope still lying open on the table. "It is over," he murmured. He did not mean the hearing. He meant the lie, the one Darren had built his entire identity around. And as the courtroom steadied itself for the next phase, I lowered my gaze to my hands and felt something I had not felt in months. A breath of relief rising through the cracks of fear. The truth had finally spoken, and its voice was thunder. If the DNA results were the explosion that cracked the foundation of Darren's case, then what came next was the slow, methodical dismantling of everything he had tried to build on top of that lie. After the courtroom settled again, Judge Meredith folded her hands and looked directly at Lowell. "Counsel, you may proceed with any remaining evidence." Lowell nodded and rose with a calmness that contrasted sharply with Darren's unraveling state. "Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, the respondent will present financial documentation related to Mr. Darren Whitford's handling of the decedent's assets prior to her passing." Darren tensed. Amber's head snapped up. Several people in the gallery murmured. They had come expecting family drama. Now they were about to witness something closer to a criminal investigation. Lowell began with the precision of a surgeon. Exhibit 9 bank statements from the account belonging to the late Martha Whitford. He handed them to the clerk, who delivered them to the judge. Lowell turned back to the room. "These statements track a series of withdrawals made in the final 3 months before Mrs. Whitford's death." He paused. "Withdrawals totaling more than $12,000. My pulse quickened, even though I already knew what was coming. Darren gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles went white. Lowell continued. "Each withdrawal was made using Mrs. Whitford's debit card. However, hospital records show that during this period, Mrs. Whitford was admitted overnight on multiple occasions and was physically unable to leave her room. This raised immediate questions." Judge Meredith glanced up sharply. "Mr. Whitford, were you authorized to make withdrawals from your mother's account during this time?" Darren blinked rapidly. "I was helping her," he said. "She asked me to get money for bills." Lowell nodded as if he expected that answer. "We anticipated that explanation, Your Honor." He lifted another sheet. But the transactions in question were not used for medical bills, hospice care, or household support. They were used for bar charges, gambling machines at Prairie Lake Casino, and purchases at a motorcycle supply shop. Another ripple moved through the gallery. Darren's lawyer stiffened his face, draining of color. Darren slammed a fist onto the table again, sounding more desperate than angry. "Those were misunderstandings. I was going to pay it back." The judge raised one eyebrow. "Using what income, Mr. Whitford? You have no employment history on record for the past 4 years. Darren's mouth opened and closed like he was searching for a lie that hadn't yet been invented. Lowell pressed on. Exhibit 10 bank surveillance photos capturing Mr. Whitford making several of the withdrawals. Photos dated and time-stamped. He displayed them one by one. Darren at an ATM in a casino lobby. Darren at a gas station with Mom's card in hand. Darren at a liquor store, eyes bleary, shoulders slouched. Darren's breathing grew ragged. "This is blown out of proportion," he muttered. Amber scooted an inch away from him. He didn't seem to notice. Lowell continued. "Exhibit 11 documentation from Prairie Lake Casino indicating that Mr. Whitford accrued gambling debt prior to these withdrawals." Darren snapped. "That is not debt. It is credit. They give people deals." The judge cut in. Mr. Whitford casino credit is debt. Darren fell silent, blinking quickly like he was trying to catch up with the reality unfolding around him. Lowell offered yet another document. We also have a small claims court record from 2 years ago regarding an altercation at a bar in which Mr. Whitford was accused of assault after refusing to pay a tab. Darren's lawyer attempted to intervene. Your Honor, that case was dismissed. Lowell nodded. Correct. Dismissed because the victim failed to appear, but the arrest record remains relevant to pattern of behavior. The judge tapped her pen twice a small but telling sign. Continue, Mr. Lowell. He did. Exhibit 12, a notarized statement from Ms. Whitford signed prior to her decline, stating that she did not grant her son access to her accounts. Darren surged to his feet. She was confused. She wrote things she did not mean. Sit down, Mr. Whitford, the judge ordered. Darren hesitated, then collapsed into the chair. Amber leaned away further, her hands gripping the edge of the bench as if she feared being pulled into Darren's downward spiral. Lowell paused long enough to let silence settle before revealing the final blow. Exhibit 13 police incident report filed by a bank employee who became concerned about potential financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Darren's eyes widened. That old woman did not know what she was talking about. Lowell remained steady. She followed protocol, Your Honor, and while no charges were filed at the time, the report contributes to an established pattern of questionable financial activity. The judge took her time reviewing the stack of documents, flipping through each page with the care of someone assembling a puzzle. When she finally looked up, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Mr. Whitford, she began slowly. These financial documents paint an extremely troubling picture. Darren swallowed hard. I was grieving, he whispered. I needed help. I was trying to take care of things. The judge leaned forward. Is that your explanation for withdrawing thousands of dollars for personal alcohol purchases, for gambling, for entertainment? Darren flinched. I was going to put it back. When? Her voice remained controlled but deadly. When were you going to put it back, Mr. Whitford? Darren looked around wildly as if searching the room for an answer. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm in an attempt to calm him, but Darren jerked away. I did not steal from her. She would have wanted me to have it. A hush fell. The judge's expression hardened. That is not how the law functions. You do not get to decide what a deceased individual would have wanted, especially when their legal will directly contradicts your claim. Darren was shaking now, visibly uncontrollably. His world was collapsing in full view of a courtroom filled with witnesses. Lowell moved back to our table and whispered softly, It is done. He was right. Darren was finished. The financial evidence had not just exposed carelessness or desperation. It had exposed intent, exploitation, greed, a willingness to take from the very woman he now pretended to mourn. Amber finally spoke, her voice thin. I did not know about the money, Darren snapped, turning toward her with a snarl. Do not lie. She recoiled, startled. The judge struck her gavel. Enough. She looked directly at Darren. Your credibility is severely compromised. And based on the evidence, the court must consider whether your actions constitute financial misconduct. Darren froze as though the words themselves were physical shackles. The judge continued. We will address remedies in the final ruling, but I will be clear. This court views your actions as deeply troubling, unethical, and potentially criminal. Those words echoed across the room. Darren's face crumpled. Amber stared at him with something like revulsion, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the air return to my lungs. Not victory, not triumph. Something quieter, something steadier. The knowledge that the truth was no longer whispering in the shadows. It was standing in the open at last. The courtroom felt tighter as we moved into the final stage of the hearing, as if the air itself understood that whatever came next would seal the fate of everything Darren had tried to take. Judge Meredith reviewed her notes meticulously for a long moment before lifting her gaze with a calm authority that made even the gallery fall silent. We will now address the matter of remedies and final distribution of the estate, she said. Her tone softened only a fraction when she turned toward me. Ms. Whitford, please remain seated." Then her eyes shifted to Darren, and any softness vanished. "Mr. Whitford, rise." Darren stood slowly, every movement weighted as though the air around him had thickened into cement. His face had lost its bravado. What remained was something brittle, something frightened, something he could no longer hide. The judge folded her hands. "This court has reviewed extensive evidence, including your financial withdrawals from your late mother's accounts, the misuse of estate funds, the attempt to sell real property without legal authority, the pattern of harassment and intimidation toward the sole beneficiary, and the fraudulent paternity claim presented in an effort to alter inheritance distribution. Each point was a clean strike of a hammer on already fractured stone." Darren swallowed hard. "I never meant for anything to get out of hand," he whispered. "I was just trying to survive." The judge did not blink. Survival does not justify exploitation, nor does it excuse deceit. She adjusted her glasses. "Based on the evidence, it is the ruling of this court that you are immediately removed from any role or authority within this estate." Murmurs rose in the gallery. Darren's shoulders sagged visibly, as if those words alone had pushed him downward. The judge continued, "Ms. Claire Whitford will retain full inheritance according to the legally executed will of Martha Whitford. All assets transfer fully to her, with no obligation to divide, compensate, or otherwise allocate funds to you." A thin gasp escaped from somewhere in the audience. I kept my back straight, even as my heartbeat thudded against my ribs. Darren shook his head slowly, as if refusal alone might reverse the legal system. "You are punishing me because you think I am a bad son," he snapped. His voice wavered, unable to find that familiar force. "She has always been your favorite upstanding citizen." The judge's expression remained unmoved. "This is not punishment. This is the law." She turned the financial documents face down on the bench. "Given the unauthorized withdrawals you made while acting under implied trust, and the substantial evidence that these funds were used for personal entertainment rather than estate responsibilities, this court orders restitution. The total amount misappropriated will be determined by a forensic accountant, and you will be required to repay it in full." Darren's mouth parted in disbelief. He stumbled a half step back, as though the room had tilted beneath him. "I cannot pay that. I have nothing." The judge's voice remained even. "Your circumstances do not absolve you of your responsibilities. If repayment is not feasible through income, legal avenues for collection will apply, including garnishment." Amber shifted uncomfortably. She looked at Darren not with sorrow or loyalty, but with dawning horror, as if realizing she had tied herself to a sinking vessel she never intended to go down with. Judge Meredith continued. "Additionally, this court acknowledges Ms. Whitford's incident report regarding harassment and intimidation perpetrated by you, Mr. Whitford. Although this hearing is not the venue for criminal matters, the evidence presented supports a recommendation that Ms. Whitford pursue a protection order through family court." Lowell placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. The judge finished reviewing the last page. Regarding the paternity claim, she lifted her brow toward Amber. "The laboratory results are definitive. This unborn child is not eligible for inheritance under state probate law." The declaration landed like a final brick, sealing a wall between Darren's delusion and reality. Amber let out a low, strangled sound. Darren turned to her, wild-eyed. "How could you do this to me?" She stiffened. "I did nothing to you. You did this to yourself. You wanted a prop, not a family." Darren raised a trembling hand toward her, but the bailiff took a step closer and he dropped it immediately. The judge tapped her pen twice more. "With all matters addressed, this court declares the estate of Martha Whitford settled. All claims by Mr. Whitford are dismissed with prejudice." The gallery stirred again. Someone whispered "wow" under their breath. Another muttered about justice finally hitting where it hurts. I kept still, my chest tight with something fierce and quiet. The judge turned to me. "Ms. Whitford, I hope you find peace moving forward. You have acted responsibly and respectfully throughout this process." I nodded, unable to speak without my voice breaking. Then the judge addressed the room. "Court is adjourned." The gavel fell with a sharp finality that seemed to slice clean through the last 2 years of fear, frustration, and grief. Amber stood immediately, grabbing her purse with trembling fingers. She did not look at Darren. She did not thank him. She did not even pause. She simply walked out of the courtroom, letting the heavy wooden door slam behind her. Darren remained frozen as though the force of the ruling had petrified him. His breath came in short, stuttered bursts, and for a moment he looked so lost that my heart twisted in a way I did not expect. He sank into his chair, his hands shaking violently. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering something urgent, but Darren seemed unable to hear or process anything. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes found mine. Not angry, not defiant, not victorious. Empty. He whispered, barely audible, "You took everything." I held his gaze steady. "I took nothing. Mom left it to me." He pressed a shaking hand over his forehead and let out a low, choking sound. The bailiff approached, asking quietly whether he needed medical attention, but Darren waved him off. He rose slowly, clutching the back of the chair for support, then shuffled toward the exit like a man carrying invisible chains. When the courtroom emptied, Lowell gathered the documents with deliberate calm. "It is over, Claire," he said softly. "You stood your ground and the truth held." I nodded, finally exhaling the breath I felt like I had been holding for months. The quiet that followed was not triumph. It was release, a slow untangling of fear from the edges of my mind. As I stepped out into the courthouse hallway, sunlight spilled through the tall windows, washing everything in a muted gold. The world had not changed, but something inside me had. Justice had not roared. It had spoken clearly, finally, unshakably, and its voice had set me free. In the days after the ruling, the storm around Darren did not quiet the way storms sometimes do. Instead, it spread outward in slow, widening circles until every corner of our small Midwestern town seemed to buzz with some version of what had happened in the courthouse. I kept my head down as much as I could, focusing on work at the assisted living facility, repairing small things around Mom's house, and trying to settle back into a rhythm of life that did not revolve around fear. But even as I tried to move forward, snippets of Darren's collapse drifted toward me from neighbors, coworkers, or the soft rustle of conversations in the grocery aisle. "Darren got kicked out of the motel," someone whispered behind me near the cereal section. "Heard he was 3 weeks behind," another voice said. "You can't just promise inheritance money that you don't have." I pretended not to hear, but each comment drove home the reality that the fallout of the hearing was not contained to the courtroom. The motel manager apparently lost patience the morning after the ruling when Darren stormed into the lobby demanding extra time, claiming he was the victim of a grand injustice and that everything would soon be reversed. When the staff reminded him he owed hundreds of dollars he could not pay, he erupted shouting about conspiracies and liars until they called security. By afternoon, he was standing in the parking lot with 2 garbage bags full of clothes and the last remnants of his ego. Amber did not come for him. Rumor had it she packed her belongings while he was at the hearing and left town entirely. Some people said she moved in with another man. Others said she went to her sister's house in Missouri. The truth did not matter. What mattered was that she had vanished the moment Darren no longer looked like a meal ticket. He had not expected that. Even during the hearing, when the judge read the DNA results, he kept glancing toward Amber as if she might step in and soothe him. But Amber had only ever been loyal to the future she imagined, not to the man standing in front of her. After the motel incident, Darren spent several nights sleeping in his car behind an old hardware store where the lights stayed on until dawn. I knew that from a neighbor who called me saying she had seen him pacing near the dumpsters, muttering to himself, punching the hood of the car. She asked whether I felt safe staying alone in Mom's house after everything. I told her I was okay. I wanted to believe it. By the 4th night, his car disappeared. At first, I feared he had come to my house again, but when I checked the camera feed, the driveway was empty. Later, I learned the car had been repossessed. He had missed too many payments, and the lender wasted no time. Now, without a room, without a car, and with most of the town quietly distancing themselves, Darren drifted like a torn leaf blown by different winds each day. Sometimes he wandered into gas stations trying to warm himself. Sometimes he knocked on doors asking for favors, only to be met with wary eyes and polite refusals. The community that once tolerated his temper now saw the truth the court had revealed: a man who took without giving, who lashed out without remorse, who expected loyalty while offering none. Eventually, a social worker from a transitional housing program found him sleeping behind a laundromat, shivering inside a thin jacket that looked older than he was. They convinced him to enter a facility outside town, one designed for men with alcohol dependency, unstable housing, and long-term unemployment. In another life, Darren would have rejected the offer out of pride. But pride cannot keep you warm. It cannot fill your stomach. It cannot keep the night from swallowing you whole. So he went. When I heard the news, I felt something shift inside me. Not pity exactly, not triumph either, but something quieter like the soft click of a door finally closing. Meanwhile, I focused on the house. Mom's house. My house now. I painted the porch railing the same pale blue she always loved. I replaced the loose floorboard in the hallway. I scrubbed the kitchen until the scent of lemon cleaner pushed out the smell of grief. On weekends, I worked in the yard cutting back overgrown shrubs and planting new bulbs near the walkway. Some neighbors waved as they passed by, offering small smiles as if silently acknowledging everything that had happened. A few brought food casseroles, bread baskets, small gestures of solidarity. I accepted them with gratitude. At night, I often sat on the porch steps watching the streetlights flicker over the quiet neighborhood. The wind would shake the maple leaves the way it always had, and every so often I thought of Mom sitting in this very spot, rocking gently in her chair, telling me stories from her classroom or humming while she sewed. In moments like that, the weight of the past year broke open inside me, and tears came not from sadness, but from release. The battle had ended. The inheritance hearing the months of threats, the constant dread, all of it belonged to a chapter behind me. Yet I could not ignore the part of me that wondered how Darren was doing, whether he hated me more today than he had yesterday, or whether the collapse had softened something in him. I wondered, but I did not reach out. Not yet. One evening after work, I received a call from the transitional facility. The counselor said Darren had asked them to notify me that he was stable for now, attending meetings and beginning to acknowledge his drinking problem. They said he was quieter than most residents, kept to himself, slept long hours. They did not ask me to visit. They only wanted me to know he was safe. I hung up the phone, slowly staring at the pattern of light spreading across the kitchen counter. Safe was not a word I had ever associated with Darren, not for him and not for me. That small change felt monumental. Days passed into weeks, and the house grew warmer, more lived in. My life began to feel solid again, not balanced on the sharp edge of someone else's anger. I still carried the scars of our childhood, of the verbal blows, the slammed doors, the years of walking on eggshells. But I also carried the strength that had pulled me through the courtroom, through the fear, through the night Darren had stood on my doorstep, pounding until my bones vibrated. I was still here, still standing, still rebuilding. Darren's downfall was tragic, yes, but it was also inevitable. The natural consequence of choices made in darkness finally dragged into the light. I did not celebrate it, but I understood it. Sometimes justice looks like a gavel crashing down. Sometimes it looks like a man with nowhere left to run, finally having to sit still and face himself. By the end of that first month, I realized something profound. The story was no longer about what Darren had taken from me. It was about what I was reclaiming, my home, my peace, my future. And in that quiet shift, I felt the first real hint of freedom blooming inside me. I did not decide to visit Darren quickly. The idea hovered around me for weeks, like a moth tapping softly against a window, neither urgent nor ignorable. Every time the phone rang or a letter arrived, a small part of me wondered if it was news from the facility saying he had relapsed or vanished or gotten himself arrested again. But each update from the counselor was brief and steady. Darren was attending the mandatory group sessions. He was quieter than the others. He slept, ate, kept to himself. No incidents, no outbursts, no alcohol. At least not within reach. Still, I hesitated. For most of my life, being around Darren meant bracing for impact. His moods, his resentments, his unpredictable anger. Even after the judge's ruling, even after the truth pulled him down like a current, he could not fight. Some instinct inside me remained wary. It is hard to unlearn fear. But there was another feeling too, one I could not ignore. a heaviness that lived in my chest tightening whenever I remembered the final moments in the courtroom when he whispered, "You took everything," with a voice that sounded more broken child than furious man. I knew I could spend the rest of my life avoiding him. The law no longer tied us together. The inheritance was settled. The house was mine. The restraining order was granted immediately after the hearing. I did not owe him anything, and yet I owed myself something. Closure. Or, at least, the attempt at it. So one gray morning in late October, when the sky hung low and the air smelled like cold metal and dying leaves, I drove across town toward the transitional facility. The parking lot was nearly empty. A breeze carried the faint clang of a flagpole against its bracket. The building itself was plain brick square and tired-looking, with a few narrow windows and a single oak tree shedding brittle leaves near the entrance. Inside, the air felt dry and warm. A receptionist glanced up from her computer and greeted me with a practiced calm. "You're here for Darren Whitford?" she asked gently. I nodded. She pressed a button to buzz open the inner door. "His counselor will take you back." A tall woman in a soft gray cardigan appeared a moment later. She introduced herself as Dana. I recognized her voice from the phone updates. She offered a small, sympathetic smile. "He's been expecting you?" she said. I felt my breath hitch slightly. Expecting. Not hoping or asking or demanding. Expecting. As if he knew that eventually the dust would settle enough for me to walk through the door. We moved down a quiet hallway where the hum of fluorescent lights echoed off the tile floor. Residents lingered here and there, some watching a muted daytime talk show, others reading or staring out the narrow windows as though unsure how they had ended up between these walls. Darren's door was halfway down. Dana knocked twice, then opened it. I stepped inside. He was sitting in a recliner near the window, thin sunlight slanting across his face. He looked smaller than I remembered, and at the same time older in a way that did not seem tied to age, but to surrender. His hair had more gray than brown, now his jaw, sharper cheeks hollower. When he turned toward me, his eyes did not burn with anger or entitlement or bitterness. They looked tired and frightened, and finally honest. "You came," he said quietly. His voice cracked mid-word. I nodded, but could not yet speak. Dana stepped back into the hall, closing the door to give us privacy. For a moment, neither of us moved. Darren shifted forward in the recliner, resting his elbows on his knees. "I am not sure where to start," he murmured. "Maybe with, 'I am sorry.'" He rubbed his hands together, fingers restless. "I'm sorry for the house thing, for the money, for lying, for yelling at you, for all of it." His voice was thin, like paper worn at the folds. I swallowed something sharp in my throat. I never thought I would hear those words from him, not in this lifetime. He continued, "I always thought Mom favored you. I always felt like I was standing outside looking in. And instead of facing that, I blamed you." He shook his head. "I blamed you for everything. Not because it was true, but because it was easier." His honesty felt surreal, as if someone had replaced him with a softer copy made of regret. I pulled out the folding chair near the dresser and sat down slowly. "I am not here to rewrite the past," I said. "What you did hurt me. It shaped my whole life in ways you still do not understand." I wanted him to feel the weight of that truth. He nodded, swallowing. "I know. And the worst part is I knew I was hurting you even then. I just didn't know how to stop." He looked up at me then, and in his eyes I saw what I had never seen before, a deep, lonely ache. Like he had spent years building a fortress of anger, only to discover it had trapped him inside. "Amber was just noise," he said suddenly. "A distraction. She made me feel like I was someone important, someone who mattered. But that was fake, and temporary, and I knew it." He paused again. His hands trembled slightly in his lap. "I didn't want your house, Claire. I just didn't want you to have anything." The words hit like a blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were honest in a way he had never dared to be. "It was jealousy," he said, plain and simple, "and fear. You were everything Mom cherished, and I was the damage she tried to fix. I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. I had felt that imbalance my whole life, and yet hearing him say it out loud cracked something inside me that had been sealed tight for years. I let out a slow breath. I am not ready to forget, I said, but I am ready to stop carrying this weight. His eyes filled with tears. That is more than I deserve. Silence stretched between us, but this time it was not sharp or dangerous. It felt like the first quiet moment in a house after a long storm when the wind has stopped screaming and the walls have stopped shaking. When I finally stood to leave, Darren did not ask for anything. Not forgiveness, not money, not help, not a place to stay. All he said was, "Thank you for coming and for listening." At the doorway, I turned back. For the first time in my life, I saw him not as the force that had shaped my fear, but as a man who had spent years losing battles no one else could see. "Goodbye, Darren," I said softly. "I hope you find some peace." His mouth twitched almost into a smile. "Maybe we both will." When I stepped outside, the cold October air wrapped around me, crisp and grounding. The sky was clearing. The wind carried the scent of fallen leaves and something else I had not felt in years, a lightness I could not name. When I walked out of the transitional facility that afternoon, the world felt strangely quiet, as if the noise of the past year had finally burned itself out. The wind rustled through the bare branches overhead, scattering leaves across the pavement in soft spirals. For the first time in a long time, I did not brace myself for what might happen next. There was no looming court date, no threat pounding on my door, no voice screaming through the phone. Just the hum of traffic in the distance and the steady rhythm of my own breath. As I drove home along the familiar two-lane road, cutting through fields browned by autumn, I realized something had shifted in me. Not a dramatic transformation, not some cinematic revelation, but a slow unfurling of space where fear used to live. I pulled into the driveway of Mom's house, my house now, and felt the same tug of emotion I always did when I saw the pale blue siding gleaming softly in the afternoon light. This was the place she'd worked 2 jobs to keep, the place I had grown up learning how to shrink myself so as not to anger my brother or disappoint my mother, the place I eventually learned to rebuild in the wake of her absence. Inside the house, the air felt warm and lived in. The faint scent of coffee lingered from that morning. A basket of folded laundry waited near the stairs. My scrubs hung neatly over a kitchen chair. Life, in its small, steady rhythms, welcomed me back. I set my keys down and leaned against the counter, letting the quiet settle around me. For years, I had believed that the only way to feel whole was to either forgive Darren entirely or cut him out completely. But sitting in his room earlier, looking at a man stripped of anger and bravado, I realized the truth was softer and far less dramatic. Closure wasn't a finish line. It was a choice. A decision to stop bleeding where you had already healed, and I had finally made it. That night, I sat on the porch with a mug of tea warming my hands. The sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long gold streaks across the grass. The maple tree whispered overhead in the cool breeze, its remaining leaves trembling like tiny flames. I closed my eyes and imagined Mom sitting beside me in her rocker, her gentle voice humming some old tune I did not remember the words to. I wondered what she would think of everything that had unfolded, of Darren's collapse, of my standing in court refusing to let him twist her memory into something selfish and cruel, of the moment I told him goodbye without bitterness shaping my voice. I like to think she would have smiled, not because of the victory in the courtroom, but because I had reclaimed myself after so many years of shrinking for his anger. Grief still came sometimes soft, but insistent. Not the sharp, desperate grief of losing her, but the lingering kind that reminds you someone shaped the walls of your heart long before they were gone. I welcomed it now. It felt like proof that love survives in the spaces we rebuild. The town began to settle back into normal life after the hearing. People still whispered about Darren in that small town, way news travels more efficiently than electricity. But the whispers no longer pierced me. They were simply echoes fading into the background. At work, the residents at the assisted living facility asked gentle questions. Some had seen my name in the paper. Others had heard things in the dining hall. I answered what I felt like answering and held the rest privately where my own peace lived now. A few weeks later, Mom's garden finally bloomed again in its late-season colors. Mums and asters stretched toward the weak November sun. I knelt in the dirt, pulling away dead stems and trimming back branches. The soil felt cold beneath my gloves, but grounding. Healing often looks like this, I realized. Not dramatic or loud, but slow and rooted and patient. Some evenings I found myself thinking about Darren in the facility, sitting in that recliner, staring out at a sky not much different from the one hanging above my porch. I did not ache for him, but I did not hate him either. What I felt was something far quieter acceptance that his road was not my responsibility to walk. He had arrived at his reckoning, and I had arrived at mine. One Saturday morning near the end of November, the facility called again. The counselor said Darren had asked whether I was doing all right. He did not ask for anything more. No favors, no money, no visits. Just a question carried through someone else's voice. It was strange hearing concern from a man who had once told me he hoped I lost the house so he could watch me crawl back. But people are complicated. Pain makes them worse. Accountability can make them better. I thanked her for calling and hung up with a small exhale. Winter settled slowly over the town. Frost crept across the porch railings. The maple tree stood bare and clean against the gray sky. I spent Christmas alone by choice, reading on the couch with a blanket pulled around me, sipping cocoa while snow tapped against the windows. Peace does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers like snowfall. On New Year's Eve, I lit a single candle on the kitchen table. One flame for everything I had survived. One for everything I had let go. One for everything I would build next. Standing in that quiet room, I realized something else, too. Darren's downfall had never been the true ending of the story. The real ending was the moment I chose not to carry the weight of his failures anymore. The moment I reclaimed my home, my voice, my sense of safety. The moment I decided that being free did not require his apology, only my release. Months later, I would drive past the facility again on my way to work and see men gathered outside, smoking, talking, laughing in clusters as the sun rose behind them. I would wonder if Darren was inside attending another meeting, or reading on his bunk, or staring out the small window, thinking of the sister he once tried to destroy and the truth that destroyed him instead. And I realized I didn't need to know. His path was no longer tied to mine. The road ahead of me stretched open and unburdened. As spring approached, I planted new seeds in Mom's garden. Kneeling in the soil, I whispered something I did not fully plan to say aloud. "Mom, the truth set me free." And the wind moved softly through the yard as if answering. If you've stayed with me until this final moment, maybe something in my story echoed a truth inside your own life. Maybe you've known what it feels like to be dismissed by someone who should have protected you, or to stand alone in a fight you never asked for, but had no choice except to face. Maybe you've watched a family member spiral so far out of control that their chaos threatened to swallow everything you were trying to build. If any part of that feels familiar, I want you to take a breath right now and remember this simple truth. You are allowed to protect what is yours. You are allowed to set boundaries even when people call you ungrateful or dramatic. You are allowed to walk away from someone who refuses to stop hurting you. And you are allowed to take back your voice, even if it trembles the first few times you use it. My story is not unique. Every town, every neighborhood, every family has its own quiet battles. Some happen behind closed doors. Some spill into courtrooms. Some live in the silence of hallways after everyone else has given up. Maybe your battle was over a house. Maybe it was over your peace. Maybe it was over your childhood. Whatever it was or still is, you deserve to stand on solid ground without explaining why you have the right to exist there. And if someone in your life tried to take that from you, remember that truth always finds its way through. Maybe not quickly, maybe not loudly, but steadily, quietly, unshakably. If this story stirred something in you, even a small spark, I want to invite you to share your thoughts below. You can tell me where you are watching from, or share the moment when you finally stood up for yourself, or the moment you wish you had. You can simply say, "I understand." You can say nothing and sit with your own memories for a while. All of it is welcome here. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who is carrying the weight of a toxic sibling or a manipulative parent or a long unspoken hurt, send this to them. Sometimes we need someone else's story to find the words for our own. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening, for walking through the hard parts and the healing ones. If you want more stories about surviving messy families, reclaiming your life, and finding quiet justice in a world that does not always offer it easily, I would be honored to share the next one with you. Until then, take care of your heart, protect your peace, and remember, you are allowed to choose the life that makes you feel safe. Always.